Hi, and welcome to JPMorgan's Making Sense. I'm Clare Kim, the Global Head of Content Strategy and Production for the Commercial and Investment Bank. And I'm here today with Derek Chollet, the head of the JPMorganChase Center for Geopolitics, to discuss a headline that's been top of mind for many people in recent days: the U.S.-Israel military operation against Iran. There's a lot to unpack, from the regional fallout of the conflict to the ripple effects across the global economy and markets. So let's get started. Derek, thank you so much for joining me today.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Derek, can you start by giving us a brief overview and timeline of what led to the U.S.-Israel military operation against Iran?
So I think you have to think of this as not something of just the last week. It's really been something that's in many ways been years in the making. Iran, as a result of an exchange between Iran and Israel in 2024, and then again last June, was uniquely vulnerable. Its air defenses were vulnerable. It had very little ability to really understand what was going on in its skies. And so after the June conflict between Israel and Iran, which the United States participated in at the end by taking out Iran's nuclear program, we were telling clients that this was a pause, not peace, that it was very likely, in fact expected, that the conflict would resume at some point. And for the better part of this year, since the beginning of the year, as we've been captivated by Venezuela and Greenland and events elsewhere, we've been telling clients, keep an eye on Iran because it is likely the conflict would resume. So whereas the timing might have been a surprise to some, the fact that it's happening is not a surprise. Now, the scale and scope of it is massive. I mean, I think it cannot be overstated, the magnitude of this operation, the first ever joint U.S.-Israeli military operation. The first truly joint operation in the sense of sharing of intelligence, operational plans, division of labor that the U.S. has conducted in this way really since World War II. We've had other coalition campaigns, but one in which the U.S. was really playing the lead role and doing the lion's share of the work. That's not the case in this operation. And the magnitude of change that we are about to see in terms of an Iran that is at least going to be weaker, probably more unstable, if not transformed altogether, will be the biggest change that the region has seen since 1979. And it's going to be a geopolitical change that could be on par with the collapse of the Soviet Union at the end of the 1980s and early 1990s, just in the sense of the second, third, fourth order effects of this change in Iran. There's a lot of uncertainty about which direction this is going to go, of course. I mean, it could get a lot worse. It could get a lot better. I'm happy to talk about where I see the various pathways.
Yeah, we'll get there.
But I think the magnitude of this is something over the long term that will define geopolitics for the rest of our lives.
So, Derek, you've been getting this question from clients and partners across the firm. How is this going to end?
So when it comes to the military campaign, my assessment is that this is going to go on for some days, perhaps weeks, but it's hard to see it extending too much longer for a couple reasons. From a U.S. perspective, you have to keep in mind what I call the 3 M's: munitions, markets, and midterms.
Okay.
And munitions, starting with that, This is a math game. And the U.S. has an abundant amount of munitions, missiles, and other sorts of ordnance that they're using against the Iranians, but then they're also using to defend Israel, Gulf states. And our partners also have finite munitions. We have a lot, but we can't do it forever. And it's a numbers game where the Iranians are also have a lot of munitions, and they're trying to use those against the U.S. and our partners. All of our strikes are about making that harder to do, taking out launchers, taking out storage sites, taking out the missiles. But in the same way the June war ended, mainly because both sides had an incentive to stop throwing punches at one another because of the supplies running low. So I think a similar dynamic could be in effect here, where at some point, and the U.S. has some control over when it defines success, because in some ways there's been a lot of rationales given for this campaign. And so there is some flexibility for the U.S. to be able to stand up and say, mission accomplished. We've done enough. We've weakened the regime. We've made it harder for Iran to project its power in the region. So now Iranian people, over to you. And oh, by the way, Iranian regime, those of you who are left, if you step out of line, we reserve the right to go back in and smack you, and which we have the capability to do. So I think there's a lot of flexibility. But the munitions is going to be something that folks are already keeping a close eye on, that you have to watch. Markets. The consensus seems to be if this is a short campaign, markets can kind of absorb the blow. It's going to be fine. There's some turbulence, some up and down, but no lasting damage. But as this goes on, you will expect to see more market impacts, which are going to change the calculus inside the United States and elsewhere about whether this is working or not, because the costs are going to grow. Okay, so keep an eye on that. Again, the consensus seems to be a couple weeks, this will be fine. But beyond that, real market impacts. And then midterms, which is really about politics. In the United States, the support for the campaign thus far is pretty tenuous, right? There's a lot of questions about what's going on. I think that can hold for a while, particularly if things seem to be improving a bit on the ground. Iranian counterattacks seem to be abating. There's more visible signs of success on the ground in terms of the campaign against Iran. Perhaps you're seeing the Iranian people rise up in a way. So that could help the politics a bit, but I think short of that, I expect the political support for this to become even more tenuous over time, particularly if you see more concerns about munitions and more concerns about market impacts, which then, to me, leads me to think that within a week's time, maybe 2 weeks' time, if this is still going on, there's a lot more talk of winding it down. Moreover, because it's not just our considerations. We have more munitions than anybody else, but our Gulf partners don't. And the country that has been the most attacked thus far by Iran is the UAE. By hundreds and hundreds of missiles and drones, the UAE has been targeted more than the Israelis have. And they don't have infinite supply. So at some point, they're going to start running out and feel vulnerable and be asking, can we start to wind this down and declare mission accomplished and move on to the next thing? So for that reason, I still project this is a days, at most weeks campaign. And then we're on to the next phase about what the future of Iran looks like.
Right. Okay. And we can have that conversation then.
Yes.
Yeah. So you classify this as an operation, a military operation. Can you sort of paint a picture for us? How different is this from the invasion in Iraq?
Well, it's very different in the sense of this is primarily being done through the air. This is a naval and Air Force operation. There are no U.S. ground troops involved. There are no U.S. or Israeli military troops involved. There might be some Israelis on the ground for all we know. But this is not Iraq. This is not, we're going to have a massive invasion of troops. We have seen in the past, going back to Kosovo in 1999 or Libya in 2011, air campaigns that have been quite extensive, that have been trying to achieve multiple goals, but one of them to weaken a regime and bring about regime change. And one thing we've learned through history is it's very hard to bring about regime change through the air alone. So it could be that I think that the plan is that they're going to weaken the regime sufficiently that then, as the U.S. administration has said, it's going to be over then to the Iranian people to take over once that regime is less able to oppress the people to take over. The challenge, however, is that what air power can do next to nothing about is guns. And right now the regime has all the guns. And so if this moves into sort of on-the-ground regime change in terms of the Iranian people rising up as they did in January.
Right.
What we saw in January was a significant protest against the Iranian government, and the Iranian government doing what it knows how to do best, which is slaughter its people. And there were thousands of Iranians killed at the hands of the regime security forces. So that's a danger here. And so another analogy I think of is 1991, after the Gulf War with Saddam. The people of Iraq, many of the people of Iraq started to stand up against Saddam. The U.S. had conducted a vigorous air campaign and ground campaign to get Saddam out of Kuwait. People rose up, and then a lot of those folks were slaughtered by Saddam in April of 1991. So that's something we have to be watchful for.
Sure. So you mentioned the political landscape that has gotten to this point and sort of that altitude that it hit earlier this year. Last week, the death of Iran's supreme leader. How does that change the situation inside Iran and across the region? And much more broadly, if you pull that out, what should we expect in terms of leadership from Europe and abroad?
So the magnitude of the death of the supreme leader cannot be overstated because he's only the second supreme leader of the Islamic Republic since 1979. He was the world's longest serving dictator. He'd been in power since 1989. There'd been a long discussion about his leaving office because of age. He was 86 years old and in ill health. So something else we were anticipating was this change in leadership that came in a perhaps unexpected way, but we knew that sooner rather than later there would be a different leader of Iran. But going back further, he's the second supreme leader in the history of the Islamic Republic. He's the fourth monarch-like figure in Iran in a century. So these transitions are pretty rare inside Iran. So what comes next? it's really anybody's guess at this point. I mean, there's a question of whether the regime holds on to power, the clerical regime stays in charge, whether there's some kind of internal struggle between the security services and the clerics, whether the opposition, in fact, rises up. These are the unknowns that we are confronting, which is why I believe that the most likely outcome is an Iran of chronic instability moving forward, in which the future of Iran is not quickly resolved. The question for us, for Iran's neighbors, for the United States, for investors is, does that Iranian instability remain something that is more like an implosion and it keeps Iran preoccupied, but basically does not metastasize outside of Iran? Or is it more of an explosion? And the ramifications of that instability in Iran spread in the same way that we saw the meltdown in Syria 10 years ago, or Libya 15 years ago, metastasize and destabilize countries around it and create refugee flows and all sorts of other problems. That's the great unknown, is if Iran remains unstable, as I think it will for some time, what is the magnitude of that instability and the ramifications of it?
Yeah. And we'll get to sort of the ripple effects for the markets and how they'll likely react and sort of the base outcomes there. But in your report to clients that you sent out this week, you placed the likelihood of regime collapse, or what you call irreversible degradation, at 65%. Can you talk about how you arrived at that number and what indicators would lead you to revise that base case?
So the Islamic Republic will never be the same. It is going to come out of this campaign whenever it ends, and I'm happy to talk about how I think it could end. It's going to come out weaker. And I do not foresee Iran being able to reconstitute the kind of capability it had pre-war, even as diminished as that was, anytime soon. The Israelis, the United States, our Gulf partners are not going to allow Iran to present the same threat in the region that it presented a week ago. So by definition, the regime is going to be weaker. And much of the air campaign, the targeting, has been conducted to weaken the ability of the regime to project power in the region and oppress its people at home. So taking out key facilities, key nodes of command and control, key capabilities throughout the country to weaken the regime. Now, obviously, the goal, the overall goal, as stated by Israel and the United States, is for that military action to enable a different kind of regime to take charge. Yet to be seen whether that's going to be possible. But we know that the regime will be weaker. I think that as we learn more about the targeting, as we learn more and we see what's happening on the ground and the impacts and whether there's fissures within the regime and whether the people of Iran start to rise up, that's going to cause the percentages to go up in terms of regime collapse or further weakening of the regime. The things we'll be watching to watch that percent go down of likelihood is if the regime maintains its consolidation, which right now it has remained fairly unified. We've not seen much evidence of breakdown within the regime. Or if they're seen as basically on the defensive when it comes to the internal struggle within Iran as the people of Iran rise up, if they do, to try to have more of a voice in the future of their own lives.
Let's turn to sort of that short-term impact for people and businesses. So what changes do you think we're going to notice in the near term, with airport closures that are ongoing, energy prices, insurance costs, trade routes, right? So
all of those, we're already living with it, right? And there's a question of how long that goes, right? How long can the airspace around these key transportation nodes in Dubai and Abu Dhabi and Doha, how long can those remain closed or very, very limited? What are the impacts of some of the Iranian counterattacks? I mean, so they are going after energy infrastructure. So far, they have not been terribly successful in doing lasting damage to that energy infrastructure, but they've certainly delayed it or certainly interrupted it. So we see LNG being shut down coming out of Qatar, for example, which will have significant market impacts. Most of our colleagues at JPMorgan Research on energy markets say that there's enough supply, particularly of crude oil, on the market that this could go on for the better part of 3 weeks and things should be okay in terms of energy prices. We've seen Brent crude go up into the mid-80s now, and that was more or less expected. What our colleagues warn, though, is if this goes on much beyond 3 weeks, then you're going to start to see big spikes. And you could see something that goes into the $115, $120 a barrel range. And that will have market impacts all around the world. But we're also seeing already how some countries are more affected than others. The United States might be relatively resilient from these energy impacts. But for example, Korea has been going through a pretty tumultuous market in the last few days because of their reliance, particularly on LNG from the Gulf, that they're no longer getting. So it's still early days, but I think the short-term disruption is profound, and it's hard to see that improving in a dramatic way as long as the confrontation is underway. All that said, I remain in the medium to long term pretty bullish on the region because, again, I come at this if you think of all of the change that the Middle East has seen in the last decade in terms of investment, and becoming a transportation, financial, tourism, AI hub of the world, all the changes in Saudi, UAE, and Qatar, the dramatic change we've seen in that part of the world, the one country that has been doing the most to undermine that has been Iran.
Okay.
Right? If you think there are two types of people in the Middle East, this is grossly oversimplifying, but two types. There's builders and there's destroyers. And so much of what we've seen in the region has been backed by builders. And Iran has been principally a destroyer. That regime has not been about trying to build a better Middle East for all. It's been about principally destroying Israel and destroying the United States. So if that regime changes outright or is at least weakened, that changes the security dynamic in the region for the better, I think, which then enables the kind of change we've been seeing over the medium to long term, even though we're going to have a lot of short-term disruption.
Yeah. And then let's actually play that out for a little bit. Just, looking beyond into the macro through this year for the broader economy and for markets, the scenarios that could play out, right? You touched on them earlier, and we're looking at sort of the short-term possibilities, like the here and now, but how drastically does this change the 2026 outlook for markets, for our econ calls?
So thus far, I don't think it changes it much because we're still in that short-term window where there's a lot of disruption for sure, but I don't think anything's happened yet as we speak today. And granted, this is changing minute by minute, but as we speak at this moment, that is a lasting disruption in a negative way. I do think that, as I said earlier, an Iran that's less able to export instability is net good for the region over the medium to long term, even if this short-term turbulence is upon us. But the question is, obviously Iran starts to score some successes against energy infrastructure in the Gulf, right? They get lucky and they take out, there's a mass casualty event of some kind. They hit something where a lot of people are killed. Or Iran, in the aftermath of all this, starts to unravel or spin out of control in a way like a Syria or like a Libya, where the conflict or the instability metastasizes throughout the region. From where I see things today, given the geography of Iran, given where it sits on the map, given that the countries, it's bordered by water on one side, and then Pakistan, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Turkey, Azerbaijan. I don't see the vectors for refugee flows right now. It could be a unstable Iran, but if that instability stays within Iran, it should not have broader effects. Also, because Iran has not been particularly well connected to the global economy in recent years, right? So the ripple effects of Iranian instability, if that remains contained, should not be that profound. But that, of course, we could be wrong, and that could change, and you could see in Iran fully melt down, Iran becoming like a Syria, where it becomes a competition for influence by countries in the region, the United States, Israel, and everyone's sort of backing their factions on the ground. That could be a recipe for longer-term instability. We haven't seen that yet.
So it's still too early to talk about obtaining stability for the region. But let's say Iran eventually stabilizes, right, and re-engages with the global markets. What does that mean for perhaps opportunities or just outcomes for the Middle East and the broader economy?
So I think this is an area, it's the upside scenario that particularly in a moment of war is very hard to sometimes think about, given all the uncertainty and the unknowns out there. But yeah, you kind of have to think of this. Iran, prior to 1979 and the Islamic Revolution, was one of the closest energy partners of the United States. It was one of the closest defense partners of the United States. It was a partner of Israel's. Now, it was a very different Middle East then, of course. I mean, the Persian Gulf was not what it is today in terms of UAE, Saudi, Qatar. But in Iran, given that 90 million people, well-educated, vibrant, innovative population, a country that sits in an important part of the world with abundant natural resources. So an Iran that comes in from the cold could be very beneficial for the United States, for Israel, for Gulf partners as well. An Iran that is not, its principal motive is not to undermine those around it or assert its influence in a way that's making regimes weaker throughout the region, but an Iran that wants to be part of a solution, right? That's very interesting. I mean, it changes energy markets, it changes the political puzzle. I mean, the defining piece of the Middle East really in the last 50 years has been Iran's role in working against trends in the region or trying to influence trends in a negative way by propping up proxy groups and trying to take advantage of instability elsewhere for its own interests. None of that has really served the people of Iran, which is why you see the people of Iran so angry and rising up, because they are looking at a country that's spent billions and billions of dollars propping up proxy groups out the region that aren't about improving the lives of everyday Iranians, or building a nuclear weapons program that isn't about improving the lives of everyday Iranians, and they're angry about that. That's in part why they're rising up. So I do think we need to, obviously, first and foremost, remain vigilant about the downside risk all the time. Keep an eye on the upside potential here, because I do think it's profound over the medium to long term.
Okay. I think that is a good place for us to wrap up. We'll leave it there.
Always good to end on a positive note.
For sure. For sure. Especially this week. I know you're getting in front of clients, you're meeting with many functions across the firm. So, and obviously so many folks are tuning into all the reports that you continue to publish.
And we'll continue to put stuff out.
Of course. Yeah. So thank you for joining and continuing to share your insights.
Sure. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to JPMorgan's Making Sense. If you've enjoyed this conversation, share your feedback by leaving a comment or review wherever you listen to podcasts. And be sure to follow our channel so you don't miss an episode.
The views or opinions expressed herein are solely those of the JPMorganChase Center for Geopolitics and may differ from the views and opinions expressed by JPMorgan Securities LLC Research Department or other departments or divisions of JPMorganChase & Co. or its affiliates. Information has been obtained from sources believed to be reliable, but JPMorganChase does not warrant its completeness or accuracy. Opinions and estimates constitute our judgment as of the date of this material and are subject to change without notice. The opinions herein should not be construed as an individual recommendation for any particular client and is not intended as advice or recommendations of particular securities, financial instruments, or strategies for a particular client. The information contained herein has been provided solely for informational purposes and does not constitute an offer, solicitation, advice, or recommendation to make any investment decisions or purchase any financial instruments and may not be construed as such.